I don't know how we ended up there. It was supposed to be a fun road trip, a break from all the stress at work, school, and life. We were driving through the countryside, not far from where we grew up, just looking for a peaceful place to camp out for a night or two. But somewhere along the way, we took a wrong turn. The GPS on my phone went blank, and the signal vanished. We tried to turn around, but the road seemed different, and we got more and more lost. It was just me, Sarah, and Nick, sitting in Nick's old beat-up car, driving down a long stretch of road that seemed to lead nowhere. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a dull gray. There were no lights, no houses, nothing but trees on either side of the road. And then, just as it started getting darker, we saw it, a small wooden sign that said, "Welcome to Dry Creek." "Should we stop here?" Sarah asked, looking worried. "It's getting late," Nick replied. "Might as well see if we can find somewhere to stay the night." We all agreed. Dry Creek sounded harmless enough, so we drove in, hoping to find a motel or maybe a gas station where we could ask for directions. The town was empty. There were old, crumbling houses on either side of the street, but no signs of life. It was like everyone had packed up and left years ago. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ground. "I don't like this," I said, glancing around nervously. "It feels... oof." "Relax," Nick said, trying to sound confident. "It's just an old town. People probably moved out." We kept driving until we spotted a small, run-down motel at the edge of town. The neon sign flickered weakly, barely spelling out "rooms available." Nick parked the car, and we all got out. The air felt thick, like it hadn't moved in years. There was no wind, no sound, just silence. "Let's check it out," Nick said, grabbing his backpack. Sarah and I followed him to the front door, which creaked loudly as Nick pushed it open. Inside, it was even worse. The lobby was dusty, with old furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A bell sat on the counter, and Nick rang it. The sound echoed through the empty building. After a few seconds, an old man appeared from the back. He had deep wrinkles, and his eyes were a strange, milky color. He smiled at us, but there was something unsettling about it. "Can I help you?" he asked in a raspy voice. "Yeah, we're looking for a place to stay for the night," Nick said. "We got lost, and..." The old man cut him off. "You can stay here, room's ready, just one room." "One room's fine," Sarah said quickly, glancing at me. I could tell she was just as uncomfortable as I was. The old man handed us a rusty key and pointed down the hall. "Room 7, he said. "End of the hall." We took the key and headed down the dimly lit corridor. The air smelled musty, like damp wood and mold. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges. Every step we took echoed in the silence. When we reached room 7, Nick unlocked the door, and we stepped inside. The room was small and basic: 2 beds, a cracked mirror, and a single lamp that barely lit the space. "This place is creepy," Sarah whispered as she sat on one of the beds. "Just for one night," Nick said, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll leave first thing in the morning." I didn't argue. I just wanted to get out of there. We decided to turn in early, hoping to get some rest before hitting the road again. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing strange noises, soft whispers, like someone was standing right outside the door. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was watching me. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, the room was pitch black. The lamp had gone out, and the only light came from a sliver of moonlight seeping through the cracked window. Then I heard it, a soft, scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the door. I held my breath, listening. The sound grew louder, more insistent. I turned to wake Nick, but he was already sitting up in bed, eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, too scared to speak. Sarah was awake too, clutching the blankets tightly around her. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. Then, the door creaked open slowly. In the darkness, I could barely make out a figure standing in the doorway, tall, thin, with long, twisted limbs. It stepped into the room, moving with an unnatural, jerky motion. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved closer, its face hidden in shadow. Suddenly, the lamp flickered back on, and the room filled with dim light. The figure was gone, but the door was still open. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice shaking. Nick nodded, already grabbing his bag. Sarah was crying softly, but she got up, and we all hurried out of the room. We ran down the hallway, through the lobby, and back to the car. As we drove out of Dry Creek, none of us spoke. The road seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly into the darkness. Finally, after what felt like hours, we found ourselves back on the main highway. We never talked about what happened that night. We just wanted to forget. But sometimes late at night, I still hear that scratching sound in my dreams. And I wonder, was it real, or was it just the middle of nowhere playing tricks on our minds? We were driving through the desert, miles away from any town or city. The sun was setting, and the sky was a deep orange, fading into purple. The air was dry, and the land around us was barren, nothing but sand and rock as far as the eye could see. I was with my friend Jake. We had been on the road for hours, and we hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. Our gas gauge was creeping towards empty, and both of us were getting nervous. "We need to find a gas station soon," Jake said, glancing at the dashboard. "I know," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "There's got to be one around here somewhere." We kept driving, watching the fuel gauge drop lower and lower. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness quickly settled over the desert. The headlights of the car were the only light around us, cutting through the pitch-black night. Just when we were about to give up hope, we saw a flickering light in the distance, a neon sign glowing weakly against the darkness. "Look," Jake said, pointing. "That's a gas station." Relief washed over us as we drove towards the light. The station appeared out of nowhere, a small old building with a single gas pump out front. The neon sign above the building flickered on and off, barely legible, but it was enough. We pulled in and parked next to the pump. Jake got out of the car and grabbed the gas nozzle while I headed inside to pay. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a bell above the door jingled softly. The inside of the station was just as run down as the outside. Dim lights, old shelves with dusty cans of food, and a faded counter with an old cash register. Behind the counter stood a man. He looked old, with gray hair and a wrinkled face. His clothes were worn and covered in oil stains. He stared at me with empty eyes, not saying a word. Hi," I said, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "We need to fill up the tank." The man didn't respond. He just stared at me, his expression blank. I hesitated, then reached for my wallet. "How much for a full tank?" I asked. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and raspy. "No charge. Just fill it up and leave." I frowned, confused. "Are you sure?" He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Just fill up and go. Don't stay." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't argue. I handed him a few bills anyway, and quickly left the station. When I got back to the car, Jake was already done pumping the gas. "Did you pay?" he asked. "Yeah, but the guy inside was weird," I said, glancing back at the station. "He told us to just fill up and leave. Didn't even want money." Jake raised an eyebrow. "That's odd." "Yeah, let's just go," I said, getting into the car. "This place gives me the creeps." Jake nodded, and we both got in the car. He started the engine, and we pulled out of the station back onto the empty road. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the station fading into the distance. but it wasn't there. I blinked, staring at the mirror. The gas station was gone, completely vanished, as if it had never been there at all. I turned around in my seat, looking back at the road, but there was nothing. Just endless desert. "Jake, did you see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "See what?" he replied, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "The gas station, it's gone. Like, completely gone." Jake glanced in the mirror, then back at the road. "What are you talking about? We just left it." "I know, but it's not there anymore," I insisted. "It's like it disappeared." Jake frowned but didn't say anything. He just kept driving, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. The road stretched on, and the desert around us seemed to grow darker, almost unnaturally so. The headlights barely pierced through the blackness, and I felt a deep sense of unease settling in my chest. Then, the car started to sputter. The engine made a strange noise, and Jake cursed under his breath. "What now?" he muttered, pulling over to the side of the road. We both got out of the car, and Jake popped the hood, checking the engine. I stood by the car, looking around. The desert was silent, too silent. There wasn't even a breeze, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. After a few minutes, Jake slammed the hood shut. "I don't know what's wrong with it," he said. "It just stopped." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Great. So what do we do now?" Jake looked around, then pointed ahead. "I think I see lights up ahead. Maybe there's another gas station or a house. We can walk there." I followed his gaze, and sure enough, there were faint lights in the distance, barely visible through the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. We started walking, leaving the car behind. The desert was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the crunch of sand under our feet. The lights ahead didn't seem to get any closer, no matter how far we walked. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the source of the lights. My heart sank when I saw what it was. It was the same gas station, the same run-down building, the same flickering neon sign. The car was gone, but everything else was exactly the same. Jake and I stood there, staring in disbelief. "This can't be right," I whispered. "We've been walking for miles. How is this possible?" Jake shook his head, speechless. We cautiously approached the gas station, and as we got closer, the front door creaked open on its own. Inside, standing behind the counter, was the same man. He looked up at us with those empty eyes and smiled, a cold, unnatural smile. "I told you to leave," he said, his voice echoing in the silent night. "But you came back." My blood ran cold. Something wasn't right. This place, this man, none of it was right. "We're leaving," Jake said firmly, grabbing my arm. "Now." We turned and started to walk away, but the ground beneath us seemed to shift. The desert stretched out endlessly in every direction, and no matter how far we walked, the gas station remained behind us. Always there, always watching. And that's when I realized we were trapped. Trapped in this forgotten place, lost in the middle of nowhere with no way out. And the worst part, we were never alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a chance to escape the noise of the city and relax in the mountains. My friends and I had rented a cabin deep in the woods, miles from civilization. It was a small, old place, tucked away from the main road, surrounded by tall trees that blocked out the sky. There were 4 of us: me, Emma, Chris, and Jordan. We had known each other since college and tried to do these weekend trips at least once a year. This time, we wanted something more remote, somewhere we could really disconnect. So, we found the cabin online, booked it, and drove out on a Friday afternoon. The drive up was long, winding through narrow roads that seemed to go on forever. The deeper we went into the woods, the more isolated we felt. By the time we arrived, it was nearly dark. The sun was just a sliver of light on the horizon, and the air was cool, with a slight breeze rustling the leaves. The cabin was exactly as advertised, old, rustic, and cozy. It had a single floor with 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living area. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and only a small, old-fashioned radio for entertainment. Perfect, we thought. Exactly what we wanted. We unloaded the car, settled in, and started making dinner. Chris and Jordan took over the cooking, while Emma and I unpacked the rest of our things. The cabin had a warm, homey feel to it, despite its age. The wooden walls were lined with old photos and faded paintings, and the furniture looked like it had been there for decades. After dinner, we sat around the fireplace, telling stories and laughing. It felt good to be away from everything, just the 4 of us, with nothing but the sounds of the forest outside. As the night wore on, we grew tired and decided to call it a night. Emma and I took one bedroom, while Chris and Jordan shared the other. The beds were small and creaky, but after the long day of driving, I was too tired to care. I drifted off to sleep almost immediately. At some point in the night, I woke up. The room was completely dark, and for a moment, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I lay there, listening to the quiet, trying to shake off the grogginess. That's when I heard it. A soft knock. 3 taps, slow and deliberate, coming from the front door. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I listened, straining to hear anything else, but the cabin was silent. I turned to wake Emma, but she was still sound asleep, breathing softly beside me. I debated whether to get up and check the door, but something held me back. I didn't know why, but a deep sense of unease had settled over me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The knock had been so quiet, almost hesitant, but it felt wrong, like it didn't belong here, in the middle of the woods, far from anyone. I lay back down, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a branch had hit the door, or it was the wind, but as I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was outside, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep again. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, and for a moment, everything felt normal. I almost forgot about the knock from the night before. Emma was already up, and I could hear her talking with Chris and Jordan in the kitchen. I got dressed and joined them, trying to shake off the lingering unease. "Did anyone hear anything strange last night?" I asked casually as I poured myself a cup of coffee. Emma looked up from her plate of eggs. "What do you mean?" "I thought I heard a knock on the door," I said, glancing toward the front door. "Like, really late. But it was probably nothing." Chris and Jordan exchanged a glance. "We heard it too," Jordan said quietly. It woke both of us up. A chill ran down my spine. "Did you check the D door?" Chris shook his head. "We were going to, but I don't know, man. It just felt weird, like someone was out there, but not someone." Emma frowned. "You're all freaking me out. Maybe it was just the wind." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. The knock had been too precise, too deliberate. We tried to brush it off, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. What had once felt cozy and safe now felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in on us. Still, we decided to stick it out. After all, we had come here to relax, and none of us wanted to admit that we were scared. The day passed slowly. We went for a hike, played cards, and tried to enjoy ourselves. But there was a tension in the air that none of us could shake. Every little sound made us jump, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. By the time night fell again, we were all on edge. We sat around the fireplace, not talking much, just staring into the flames. The forest outside seemed darker than before, and the wind howled through the trees, making the cabin creak and groan. Eventually, we couldn't avoid it any longer. It was late, and we needed to sleep. We reluctantly headed to our rooms, each of us hesitating at our doors as if hoping someone else would suggest staying up all night together. But no one did. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. I didn't want to fall asleep, didn't want to hear that knock again. But sleep came eventually, pulling me into a restless, uneasy slumber. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark again, and at first I couldn't tell what had woken me. Then I heard it, the knock. 3 taps, slow and deliberate, just like the night before. This time it was louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. My eyes darted to the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Then another knock, this time from the back door. 3 taps, echoing through the cabin. I turned to wake Emma, but she was already sitting up, her eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I whispered back. "But it's at both doors." We heard movement from the other room, and a moment later, Chris and Jordan appeared in the doorway, both pale and tense. "It's at the back door now," Chris said quietly. "What do we do?" None of us had an answer. We stood there, frozen in place, listening to the knocking, which had grown louder and more frequent. It was coming from all sides now, first the front door, then the back, then the windows. Always 3 knocks, always slow and deliberate. Something was trying to get in. "We have to leave," I said finally, my voice shaking. "We can't stay here." "But how?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with fear. "It's all around us." "We'll make a run for the car," Chris suggested. "If we all go together, we can make it." We nodded in agreement, though the fear in our eyes was clear. None of us wanted to go outside, but staying inside felt even worse. We gathered our things as quickly as we could, our hands trembling. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was outside knew we were trying to escape. "Ready?" Jordan whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the knocking. We all nodded. Chris took a deep breath and opened the front door. The night outside was pitch black, and the air was cold and heavy. We didn't waste any time. We ran. The forest seemed to close in around us as we sprinted towards the car, our footsteps loud in the otherwise silent night. I could hear the knocking behind us, growing fainter as we put distance between ourselves and the cabin. Finally, we reached the car. We piled in, and Chris fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the narrow dirt road, leaving the cabin behind. None of us spoke for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the distant howling of the wind. I stared out the window, watching the dark trees blur past, trying to shake the feeling that we were being followed. Eventually, the road widened and we reached the main highway. The tension in the car eased slightly, but none of us dared to look back. We never talked about what happened at that cabin. We never went back, and we never rented another place in the woods. Something had been out there, something that wanted to come in. And whatever it was, it hadn't stopped knocking. Even now, back in the safety of my apartment, I can still hear it sometimes, late at night. That soft, deliberate knock. 3 taps, and I wonder, what would have happened if we had opened the door?